The dress was finished, and it meant nothing now. Corinth had spent 3 weeks sewing it by candlelight, white fabric, gold thread, forming her mother's protection patterns along the sleeves for a man who would never see her wear it. The dress was the color of winter morning, when frost clings to everything and the world holds its breath. Beautiful, useless, a promise made to herself that no one would keep. She sat in the small room above her grandmother's cottage at the edge of the Ashen Territories, where the forest pressed close and the wind carried the scent of pine and old snow. The candle on the table had burned down to a stub. Her neck ached. The dress lay across her lap like something alive, something that demanded to be finished even though Corinth had stopped believing in the night it was meant for. "You're pulling the thread too tight." Grandmother Elowin stood in the doorway, 70 years old and sharp as winter itself. She did not move the way old women were supposed to move in stories, slowly and carefully preserving themselves. She moved like someone who had survived enough to know that caution was overrated. "I know." Corinth did not look up. Her hands continued their work, needle through fabric, pull needle through fabric pull. The rhythm was the only thing keeping her steady. "Your mother used to do that, pull too tight when she was worried." Elowin crossed the room and sat in the chair beside the window, the one that had been her husband's before the fever took him before Corinth was born. Made her stitches last longer, but they were harder to undo if she made a mistake. "I'm not making a mistake." "Didn't say you were." The silence that followed was the kind that comes from living in close quarters with someone who knows when to speak and when to let quiet do its work. Outside, the night was deep and cold. Inside, the candle flame bent and straightened in some draft Corinth could not feel. Elowin watched her granddaughter sew. The girl had her mother's hands long-fingered and steady, good for delicate work. Good for healing, though Corinth did not know yet how good. She had her father's stubbornness, that border guard determination to finish what was started no matter how the wind turned. And she had something else, something older, that came from further back than either parent. "He'll be here in 2 days, Corinth said finally. Dorian sent word. "He'll escort us to Velmore Court himself." Generous of him. He promised. "At midwinter assembly he'll announce it, in front of the 12 packs. Elowin said nothing. She had opinions about Dorian Greymont, but she had learned a long time ago that young people in love did not want opinions from old women who remembered what happened to the last 3 generations of young people in love. They wanted support. They wanted belief. They wanted permission to hope that this time would be different. Corinth set down her needle and held up the dress, checking the line of stitches in the candlelight. The gold thread caught the flame and glowed. For a moment, the dress looked like something magical, something that could transform the person wearing it. "It's beautiful," Elowin said. "It's finished." "That's not the same thing." Corinth folded the dress carefully, smoothing the fabric with hands that had learned gentleness from years of working with healer Sienna in the border village's only healing house. Hands that could clean wounds without causing pain, that could prepare poultices that drew infection, that could feel fever through skin and know whether it would break or build. Hands that she had recently discovered behaved strangely sometimes. A warmth that started in her palms and spread up her arms. She did not tell her grandmother about that. Not yet. There were some things that needed to be understood before they could be spoken, and Corinth did not understand the warmth. Elowin rose from the chair, joints creaking in the cold. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we pack. The day after we leave for a court that doesn't want us and a boy who doesn't deserve you." "Grandmother, I know you love him. He promised you. You've sewn a dress." Elowin crossed to the door, then paused. "Your mother loved your father. He promised her a life. She sewed her own wedding dress." A pause. "She was happy. For the years she had, that's worth something." After Elowin left, Corinth sat alone with the finished dress and the dying candle. She thought about her mother, who had died when Corinth was 5, too young to remember much beyond the smell of herbs and the sound of soft singing. She thought about her father, the border guard who had raised her with awkward tenderness until the winter cold took him 2 years ago, leaving Corinth with nothing but Elowin and the healing work and the particular loneliness of being young in a place where young people left as soon as they could. She thought about Dorian, who had seemed like an answer when he arrived 6 months ago, traveling through the territories on pack business. He was handsome in the way of men who have always been told they are handsome. He was charming in the way of men who have learned that charm opens doors. And he had looked at Corinth like she was something precious, something worth keeping. At least she had believed he looked at her that way. The candle went out. Corinth sat in the dark and did not move to light another. Some things were easier to think about in darkness. The morning came too quickly and too bright. Corinth woke to knocking and Cassia's voice calling through the door. He's here. Dorian's here, and he brought a carriage. Cassia was Corinth's age 24 and had been her closest friend since childhood, back when they used to steal apples from the orchard and tell each other elaborate lies about the futures they would have. Cassia had stayed in the border village when others left. She had a gift for organization that made her invaluable to the village council and a gift for loyalty that made her invaluable to Corinth. She burst into the room now with the energy of someone who had already been awake for hours, probably helping Elowin pack, probably making lists of things that needed to be done before they left. A carriage, Cassia repeated, as if this were significant. An actual carriage, with the Greymont crest on the door. Corinth rose from the bed still wearing yesterday's clothes. She had not slept well. The dress hung on the wall where she had placed it ghostly white in the morning light. How does he look? Like someone who's been traveling. Tired, but he smiled when he asked for you. Cassia moved to the window, looked out at the village below. He brought guards, 4 of them, and supplies for the journey. Corinth, he's really doing this. He's really taking you to Velmore Court. I know. Then why do you look like you're going to your own execution? Corinth did not answer. She crossed to the wash basin, splashed cold water on her face, tried to wake the parts of herself that felt numb. When she looked in the small mirror above the basin, she saw what Cassia saw, a young woman with dark hair that needed brushing, eyes that needed sleep, and an expression that needed conviction. The dress is finished, Corinth said. I know, I saw it. It's beautiful. Mother's patterns, the gold thread. She would have loved it. Corinth turned from the mirror. Cassia, if I asked you a question, would you answer honestly? Always. Do you think I'm making a mistake? Cassia was quiet for a moment. Outside, they could hear the sounds of the village waking horses being prepared, Dorian's voice giving instructions to his guards. Normal sounds, ordinary sounds, the sounds of a life continuing while decisions were being made that might change everything. I think, Cassia said carefully, that you're doing what feels right, and that's all anyone can do. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. They went downstairs together. Elowin was already in the main room packing herbs and medicines into a traveling case with the methodical efficiency of someone who had done this before. She looked up when they entered. He's waiting outside, wants to see you before we leave. Elowin's tone was neutral, but her eyes said everything her voice did not. Corinth found Dorian by the carriage. He was 25 tall with the kind of face that looked better in profile than straight on. He wore traveling clothes that were too fine for the border territories, too clean for someone who had actually been on the road. When he saw Corinth, he smiled, and the smile was warm and easy, and exactly like the smile she remembered. Corinth. He crossed to her, took her hands. His hands were soft, she noticed. Not the hands of someone who worked, the hands of someone who had always had other people to work for him. The dress is finished, she said. I can't wait to see it. He squeezed her hands, a gesture meant to be reassuring. Everything is arranged. We'll arrive at Velmore Court 3 days before the assembly. You'll have time to rest to prepare. And then, he paused the pause of someone about to say something meaningful. And then everyone will know. No more hiding, no more waiting. Corinth noticed something then. His touch felt ordinary. Nothing more than skin on skin. She wondered when that had changed or if it had ever been different. Thank you, she said, because it was what he expected. I promised you. Dorian released her hands. I promised, and I keep my promises. The journey to Velmore Court was supposed to take 4 days. They made it in 3. Dorian was in a hurry, though he did not say why. They traveled from dawn to dusk, stopping only when the horses needed rest or when Elowin insisted on breaks in a tone that did not allow argument. Cassia rode in the carriage with Corinth and Elowin, while Dorian rode ahead with his guards, ostensibly to secure lodging at the stops along the way. On the second day, healer Sienna appeared at their noon rest stop. She walked out of the forest like she had been waiting there, which perhaps she had. Sienna was 62 years old and had been the Ashen Territory's only healer for 40 years. She had taught Corinth everything about herbs and remedies and the particular art of helping people live with dignity when healing was no longer possible. She was also dying. Corinth saw it immediately, the weight loss that had accelerated over the past month, the pallor that no amount of sun could warm. The way Sienna moved carefully, preserving energy like someone who knew their supply was limited and would not waste it. You shouldn't be here, Corinth said, embracing her. You should be resting. I'll have plenty of time to rest soon. Sienna held Corinth at arm's length, studied her face. You look tired. I'm fine. You're lying, but that's allowed before a big journey. Sienna glanced at the carriage at Elowin watching from the window. I came to give you something. She pulled a small leather journal from her bag, worn and stained with decades of use. Corinth recognized it immediately as Sienna's personal healing journal, where she recorded every remedy, every success, every failure over 40 years of practice. I can't take this. You can. You will. Sienna pressed the journal into Corinth's hands. I've taught you everything I can teach at the border, but Velmore Court has healers I trained with, physicians who studied with masters I only read about. If there's knowledge that can help me, it's there. Sienna. The wasting sickness has 3 months left in it, maybe 4 if I'm stubborn. Sienna said this calmly, the way she said everything without drama or self-pity. I'd like to use that time teaching the next healer for Ashen territories, but I'd like even more to be wrong about how much time I have. Corinth's throat was tight. The court healers might know something we don't, might have seen this before, or they might confirm what I already know and you'll come home knowing you tried. Sienna smiled, and it was the saddest expression Corinth had ever seen on that weathered face. Either way you go, you learn, you come back and teach others. That's how healing works. That's how we survive. They held each other for a long moment. When Sienna pulled away, she looked past Corinth to where Dorian sat on his horse speaking with his guards. That's the boy, yes. He has a weak chin. Sienna, I'm old. I'm dying. I'm allowed to notice weak chins. Sienna touched Corinth's cheek, a gesture she had made 1,000 times when Corinth was learning, when she made mistakes, when she needed gentleness. Go to the court. Wear your mother's dress. Let the boy make his promises in front of everyone. And then trust your instincts. My instincts. You know what I mean. And Sienna walked back into the forest before Corinth could ask what she meant by that. That night, Corinth opened Sienna's journal. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting sketches of plants, notes about dosages and reactions in the specific ways different bodies responded to the same treatments. On the inside cover, Sienna had written a single line: healing is not about defeating death. It is about honoring life in its time. Corinth read every page as the carriage rolled toward Velmore Court. She read by lamplight, while Cassia and Elowen slept. She read while Dorian rode ahead, clearing their path, making everything smooth and easy and perfect. And on the last page, she found something Sienna had not mentioned: a pressed flower, dried and delicate. Beneath it, in handwriting that was not Sienna's, but older, more elegant: when your hands grow warm near him, you will know. 3 generations carried this gift. Do not ignore the signs. Your mother, Corinth's palms began to tingle as she read the words. She closed the journal quickly, pressed her hands against her skirt. The sensation faded slowly, leaving only questions. Velmore Court rose from the landscape like something that had always been there, like the mountains themselves had decided to take a different form. Black stone walls, towers that reached toward the sky as if trying to escape the earth. And everywhere the smell of power smoke and iron and the particular scent that comes from too many predators gathered in one place. Corinth saw it from a distance first as their carriage crested the final hill. She saw the 12 banners flying from the ramparts, one for each of the great packs. She saw the iron gates standing open, guards in formal livery checking every arrival. She saw a world she did not belong to and felt her stomach twist with something that was not quite fear and not quite excitement. Breathe, Elowen said from beside her. You're holding your breath. Corinth breathed. The carriage passed through the gates. Inside the courtyard was chaos made orderly, servants directing new arrivals to their quarters, stable hands managing dozens of horses, wolves in human form, moving with the careful awareness of predators who knew they were surrounded by other predators. A woman was waiting for them. She stood apart from the chaos, 70 years old or thereabouts, wearing a dress of deep burgundy that spoke of wealth but not ostentation. Her hair was silver, pulled back in a style that had been fashionable 40 years ago, and apparently remained so through sheer force of personality. When she saw their carriage, she smiled, and the smile transformed her face from merely elegant to genuinely warm. Dorian dismounted, quickly went to the woman, bowed slightly. They spoke in voices too low for Corinth to hear. That's Lady Marguerite Voss, Elowen said quietly. I knew her, a long time ago. You knew her. She came to the border territories during the last territorial conflict, brought medical supplies, negotiated safe passage for healers. Elowen's voice carried something Corinth had rarely heard from her grandmother: respect, bordering on affection. She was younger then, we all were. Lady Marguerite approached their carriage. Up close, she was even more formidable, with eyes that saw everything and a bearing that suggested she had spent her entire life walking into rooms and deciding what happened in them. Elowen Ashwood. Marguerite's voice was cultured but not cold. It's been 40 years. 38. Elowen stepped down from the carriage without assistance. You're still terrifying. And you're still stubborn. Marguerite laughed, a sound that was bright and genuine, and embraced Elowen with the ease of old friendship. Then she turned to Corinth. And this must be the girl who has Dorian Greymont so agitated. Corinth, my lady. Just Marguerite. We don't stand on ceremony with Elowen's family. Marguerite studied Corinth with an intensity that felt less like judgment and more like cataloging, like she was filing away details for later use. You have your grandmother's eyes and your mother's hands, I'd wager. You knew my mother. I knew of her, the border healer with the gift. Marguerite glanced at Elowen, some communication passing between them that Corinth could not decipher. Your grandmother wrote to me when your mother died. I'm sorry I could not attend the remembrance. The conversation was interrupted by Dorian, who appeared with servants to help with their luggage. There were introductions, instructions, the flurry of arrival logistics that prevented actual conversation. Corinth found herself swept along with Cassia toward the east wing of the court, where visiting guests of minor importance were housed. The room they were given was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a fireplace that filled the space with smoke instead of heat whenever they attempted to light it. Cassia immediately began organizing their belongings with her characteristic efficiency. This is it, Cassia said, hanging the white dress carefully in the wardrobe. 3 days until the assembly, 3 days until everything changes. Corinth sat on the bed, feeling the exhaustion of travel settle into her bones. Through the window, she could see the inner courtyard, could see wolves from a dozen different packs moving through the space with the careful choreography of people who knew exactly where they stood in relation to each other. Cassia. Yes. My mother left me a message in Sienna's journal. Cassia stopped unpacking. What kind of message? Something about my hands, about a gift 3 generations carried. Corinth held up her palms, studying them like they belonged to someone else. She said I would know when I met him. Him who? I don't know. Corinth lowered her hands. I thought she meant Dorian. When he first came to the territories, when he held my hands, I felt something. Heat. I thought it was love. And now I don't feel anything when he touches me. Corinth looked at Cassia. What does that mean? Cassia came to sit beside her on the bed. She took Corinth's hand, held it between her own. It means you're paying attention, and that's more than most people do. They sat together in the small room with the smoking fireplace, and outside the court prepared for the assembly, where promises would be made or broken, where futures would be decided, where a girl from the border territories would discover whether the dress she had sewn for 3 weeks by candlelight would be the beginning of something or the end. The Great Hall was everything the rumors had promised. It stretched the length of the main building, vaulted ceiling, lost in shadows, despite the hundreds of candles burning in iron chandeliers. The walls were hung with tapestries depicting the history of the 7 territories, battles and truces, hunts and harvests, the rise and fall of pack lines that no longer existed. Long tables ran parallel down the length of the hall, already laden with food, though the assembly would not begin until tomorrow. Corinth entered with Cassia and Elowen, following the stream of guests making their way to the informal reception that preceded the formal gathering. She wore a simple dress of dark blue, saving the white dress for the assembly itself. Her hair was pulled back in the style Elowen had shown her, severe but elegant. She looked, she hoped, like someone who belonged. The hall was full of wolves in human form, their predator nature barely contained beneath courtly manners. Corinth could feel it, the particular tension that comes from too many alphas gathered in too small a space. Conversations were polite but cautious. Laughter was measured. Even the servants moved with careful awareness, like prey animals navigating a landscape full of things that could kill them. Dorian found her quickly. He looked different here, Corinth noticed. More comfortable, like he had put on clothes that fit better than the ones he wore in the border territories. You look beautiful, he said, taking her arm in. Thank you. I want to introduce you to some people, important people. He guided her through the crowd, pointing out pack leaders, senior advisors, wolves whose names carried weight. Corinth smiled and nodded, and remembered none of it, too focused on the fact that Dorian's hand on her arm felt like nothing but pressure. They were near the second table when Corinth saw her. The woman was perhaps 24 tall, with dark hair that fell past her waist, in a dress of deep wine red that must have cost more than everything Corinth owned. She stood beside an older man who had the same sharp features, the same way of holding herself that suggested perfect awareness of the space she occupied. When the woman saw Dorian, she smiled. It was not a cruel smile. It was worse than that. It was the smile of someone who had already won something and was being gracious about it. Dorian's hand tightened on Corinth's arm. Just slightly. Just enough. Isolde, he said, and his voice carried something Corinth had never heard in it before. Uncertainty. Dorian. Isolde Fairchild crossed to them with the unhurried grace of someone who had never needed to rush for anything. She looked at Corinth with eyes that assessed and dismissed in the same glance. And this must be her. The older man, Lord Aldrich Fairchild Corinth realized, stood a few paces back watching. Corinth Ashwood. Dorian's voice was too formal now, too careful. May I present Lady Isolde Fairchild of the Red Oak Pack? Isolde extended her hand. Corinth took it. The handshake was brief, correct, and utterly devoid of warmth. The border territories, Isolde said. How fascinating. You must find the court overwhelming. Not overwhelmingly so. Well, you'll adjust, I'm sure. Isolde turned to Dorian, placed her hand on his arm with the casual ease of someone who had done it many times before. Dorian, father wants to speak with you about tomorrow's arrangements. Something about the seating. Dorian looked at Corinth, then at Isolde, then at Aldrich, watching from his position of careful distance. Of course, Corinth, I will return shortly. He left. Just like that, he left, following Isolde and her father toward the far end of the hall where the pack leaders gathered. Corinth stood alone in the middle of the great hall, surrounded by hundreds of people who did not know her and did not care to and understood with sudden, perfect clarity what was about to happen. Cassia appeared at her elbow. Corinth, I know. You should leave. Go back to the room. No. Corinth's voice was steady, which surprised her. No, I'm going to stay. I'm going to watch this happen. So she stayed. She watched Dorian stand beside Isolde at the head table. She watched Lord Aldrich place his hand on Dorian's shoulder in a gesture that looked like friendship but felt like ownership. She watched Isolde laugh at something Dorian said and watched Dorian's face transform with relief, like he had been holding his breath and could finally exhale. Elowen found her near the third table, standing in a space that was neither in the crowd nor apart from it. We're leaving, Elowen said. Not yet. Corinth, I need to hear it. Corinth turned to her grandmother. I need to hear him say it. Otherwise, I'll always wonder if I was wrong. Elowen's face softened in the way it rarely did, in the way it only did when Corinth was small and had fallen and needed to know that pain was temporary, that wounds healed, that life continued after breaking. Your mother said the same thing, Elowen said quietly. About your father. She needed to hear him choose her before she could believe it was real. Did he? Eventually, but she waited a long time. The hall had grown quieter. Not silent, but the kind of quiet that comes when something significant is about to happen and people want to witness it. Corinth felt eyes turned towards her, felt the particular weight of attention from people who smelled blood in the water. Dorian approached. He did not look at her directly. That was the first sign. The second was the way he held his shoulders braced like someone about to deliver bad news and wanting it over with. Corinth, her name in his mouth sounded like an apology before he even began. I need to speak with you. Then speak. He glanced around at the people nearby, at the wolves pretending not to listen while listening intently. Perhaps somewhere more private. Here is fine. Dorian's jaw tightened. For a moment he looked angry, but it passed quickly, replaced by something worse, resignation. I've had to make a decision. For my pack. For my family. What decision? The alliance with the Fairchild pack. It's important. The Eastern Territories are unstable, and my father needs... He stopped, started again. Isolde and I, the formal announcement will be tomorrow at the assembly. But I wanted to tell you first. I wanted you to hear it from me. Corinth looked at him. Really looked at him. 25 years old, handsome, charming, weak-chinned, as Sienna had said. A man who had made promises by candlelight in the border territories where no one important could hear them, and was now breaking those promises in the great hall of Velmore Court, where everyone important was watching. I see, she said. I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. I should have... He reached for her hand. She moved it before he could touch her. Don't. Corinth, please understand. I understand perfectly. And she did. She understood that she had sewn a dress for 3 weeks by candlelight for a man who was never going to keep his promises. She understood that she had allowed herself to hope for something she should have known better than to hope for. People were watching, 5 of them nearby, maybe more. Enough to make this public. Enough to make this the story people would tell about the border girl who came to court and thought she could be something she was not. Corinth felt the heat rise to her face. She felt the white dress hanging in the wardrobe in the east wing, waiting to be worn, useless now. She felt every stitch she had sewn and every hope she had allowed herself to carry. But she did not cry. That at least she could control. "Thank you for telling me," she said, and her voice came out steady level, empty of everything except the careful courtesy of someone who refused to give satisfaction to the people watching. "I hope the Alliance serves your pack well, truly." She turned before he could say anything more. Before Isolde could say anything, because she could see in her peripheral vision that Isolde was approaching, and there was something in the woman's expression, not quite pity, not quite triumph, that Corinth had no intention of witnessing up close. Eowyn and Cassia flanked her, immediately forming a protective barrier as they walked toward the side exit of the hall. Corinth kept her head up, her shoulders back, her pace measured. She would not run. She would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her run. The corridor outside the great hall was colder than the hall itself, the stone walls breathing the damp chill of late autumn. The torches were sparser here, casting long shadows between the archways. Corinth walked until she reached the first archway that opened onto an inner courtyard, then stopped. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them against her skirt, tried to still them, failed. "He never deserved the dress," Cassia said quietly. Her voice was firm, certain, the voice of someone who had made a decision and would not be moved from it. "I know." Corinth's voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "I know that. Your mother's patterns. 3 weeks of work, all for a man who—" "Cassia," Eowyn's voice cut through gently. "Not now." They stood together in the cold corridor, 3 women from the border territories, where people said what they meant and meant what they said, where promises were kept, or not made at all, where a girl could sew a dress by candlelight and expect it to mean something. Corinth ran her fingers along the gold thread embroidered on her sleeve, not the white dress, but the blue one she wore now. Her everyday dress, her real dress. The one she had made for herself, not for someone else's vision of who she should be. It was exactly then that she heard the footsteps. Not the kind that belonged to servants or casual passersby. These were different, deliberate. The kind that changed the air before the person appeared, as if the space itself adjusted to accommodate what was coming. 3 figures turned into the corridor from the opposite end. The first was broad-shouldered and red-haired, with a face that suggested he found most things amusing, but rarely bothered to explain why. He wore a thick traveling cloak, despite being indoors, the crest on it unfamiliar to Corinth, but clearly significant from the way he moved, like corridors belonged to him personally. The second was taller, sharp-featured, with dark eyes that tracked movement with predatory precision. He moved like someone who had never entered a room without knowing every exit, every threat, every advantage. The third was not smiling. He was the tallest of the 3, with shoulders that filled his black cloak as if the fabric had been measured for every angle of his body. Dark hair, neat but not styled. A face that would have been handsome if it had ever relaxed but did not relax, did not offer anything except careful attention and the kind of stillness that made everything around him seem louder, faster, less controlled. His eyes were deep brown, almost black in the torchlight, and when they found Corinth standing in the corridor with her shaking hands and her careful posture, they did not slide past the way most eyes did. They stopped. They stayed. He looked at her the way someone looks when they recognize something they have been searching for without knowing they were searching. Corinth's hands stopped shaking. Something changed in her palms, not burning, but present, steady, a heat that felt like recognition. The 3 men stopped a few paces away. The red-haired one spoke first, his voice carrying easy amusement. "You came from the direction of the Great Hall." It was not a question. "And you're standing in a cold corridor away from the feast." That usually means one of 2 things. The sharp-featured one finished the thought, his tone polite, but edged with something that might have been interest or might have been calculation. It usually means someone did something stupid. Cassia drew a slow breath beside Corinth. Eowyn placed a hand on Corinth's arm, a steadying touch. The third man had not spoken, but his eyes had not left Corinth's face. He took one step forward ahead of his companions, and when he did, the air in the corridor did something strange. It condensed. It grew heavier, the way it does before a storm, when the pressure shifts and every animal with instinct goes quiet. Corinth felt his scent before she understood she was feeling it. Cedar and dark earth, and something beneath both, something old and patient and entirely certain of itself. The red-haired man made a sound that might have been a warning. Lucian. So that was his name? Lucian Thorn, the Alpha King. The ruler of Velmor and the 7 territories that answered to it. The man standing in a corridor looking at Corinth like he had been waiting for her. When he finally spoke, his voice was low controlled, carrying the kind of weight that belonged to someone who had never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. Are you hurt? The question surprised her. Not an introduction, not a pleasantry, just a simple direct question that assumed she might need help and was offering it without fanfare. No. Corinth's voice was steadier than it had been moments ago. I'm not hurt. Then why are you standing in a corridor instead of at the feast? The red-haired man made another sound, this one definitely amused. The sharp-featured one looked at the ceiling with the serene expression of someone pretending he was somewhere else. Corinth raised her chin. She had been dismissed tonight publicly by a man who had promised her a future and delivered humiliation instead. She was tired, she was embarrassed, and she was standing in front of the Alpha King who apparently thought he had the right to question every woman he found in corridors. Do you always stop to question women in hallways, or only when you're bored with the banquet? The red-haired man let out a laugh, short and genuine. The sharp-featured one raised an eyebrow with an expression that clearly said interesting. Lucian did not smile, but something in his face changed, some small shift that suggested the answer had not been what he expected and was somehow exactly what he needed. I'm not bored, he said. I'm tired of people performing for me. You're the first person tonight who's spoken to me like a person instead of a title. Maybe that's because I don't know you. You know who I am. I know the title, Corinth said, echoing his own words. I don't know you. The corridor was very quiet. Even the torches seemed to burn more softly, as if unwilling to interrupt what was happening. Lucian took another step forward. He was close enough now that Corinth could see the details, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the silver threading through his dark hair at the temples, the way his hands remained still at his sides, not reaching, not demanding, just present. What is your name? He asked. Corinth felt the question land somewhere it had no business landing, in the center of her chest, where the embarrassment from the Great Hall was still sitting like an ember. Corinth, she said. Corinth Ashwood. Corinth from the border territories. Again, not a question. He knew, of course he knew, and Alpha King knew everything that happened in his court. Corinth from nowhere in particular. Something moved across his face, then too quick to be named, but present enough to see. Not pity, not amusement, something closer to recognition. I know every place in my territories, Lucian said, and there was something in those words that sounded less like arrogance and more like a man stating a simple fact. And I can tell you that none of them would do you justice. The red-haired man stepped forward, breaking the strange tension in the corridor with the ease of someone who had done this before many times. I'm Garrett Frost, this is Theo Sterling, and you've already met our king, who apparently forgets basic introductions when he's being dramatic. Theo Sterling inclined his head slightly toward Corinth, the gesture polite, but with an edge of assessment, like he was solving a puzzle and had just found an important piece. Lucian did not look away from Corinth. The feast will continue for several more hours, he said, and the shift in his tone was subtle but present, formal edges returning, but softer than they had been, like a door being held open rather than closed. You should not spend them in a corridor. I was leaving. I know. His eyes moved briefly to the blue dress she wore, to the way she held herself, shoulders back, chin up, every line of her body radiating dignity, despite what had just happened in the Great Hall. But you don't have to. Corinth should have said no. She had a very clear list of reasons to say no. She had just been publicly rejected. She was exhausted. She was standing in front of the Alpha King, who had power she could not begin to comprehend, and who was looking at her in a way that made her palms tingle with that strange recognition. She said nothing for a long moment, and then she said 1 hour. Garrett straightened. Theo's expression shifted to something that might have been approval. Lucian held her gaze and nodded once, a small gesture that somehow felt like the most important agreement ever made in a cold corridor under sparse torchlight. Corinth Ashwood, 23 years old, daughter of border healers, seamstress of unworn dresses, turned and walked back toward the Great Hall with the Alpha King of Velmore slightly behind her, and to her left, Garrett and Theo forming a loose perimeter around them both. Behind her, Elowin and Cassia exchanged a glance. Elowin's face was unreadable. Cassia looked like she had just watched something impossible happen and was still deciding whether to believe it. The Great Hall looked different the second time Corinth entered it, or perhaps she was the one who was different. She walked through the crowd with Lucian behind her, and every head that turned was turning because they could feel what she had felt in the corridor, that particular shift in air pressure that followed Lucian Thorne wherever he went. Across the hall, she saw Dorian. He noticed. Of course he noticed. His eyes found her through the crowd, and the expression on his face was one she had not expected: confusion. Genuine confusion, as if the version of Corinth he had constructed in his mind did not include this particular possibility. Isolde was saying something to him. He was not listening. Corinth looked away. She did not need to see his face anymore. She did not need his validation or his regret or his belated understanding that he had made a mistake. She had 1 hour promise to a man whose presence made her hands warm and whose first question had been, "Are you hurt?" instead of "Who are you?" That was enough. That was Corinth was beginning to understand more than enough. The hour became 3. Corinth had not intended to stay that long. She had meant what she said 1 hour, and then she would return to the cold room in the East Wing with the smoking fireplace with Cassia and her quiet observations with the white dress hanging in the wardrobe, like a ghost of something that had never been real. But Lucian did not speak the way most men spoke. He did not fill silence with his own voice. He asked questions and then listened to the answers with the complete attention of someone who asked because he genuinely wanted to know, not because conversation was expected or useful or a means to some other end. They sat at a table near the back of the great hall, not at the head where he belonged, where the pack leaders gathered in their careful hierarchies. Garrett and Theo positioned themselves nearby, close enough to intervene if needed, far enough to allow privacy. Around them, the feast continued, wolves from 12 territories eating and drinking and performing the elaborate dance of pack politics that Corinth was only beginning to understand. Lucian asked about the border territories, not in the way people usually asked, with polite disinterest or thinly veiled condescension. He asked specific questions. About the forest and the edge of the Ashen Lands, about the healing work Corinth did with Sienna, about the particular challenges of living in a place where resources were scarce and winter was long and help was days away when it came at all. Corinth found herself talking in a way she rarely talked. About her father, the border guard, who had taught her that duty was not the same as sacrifice, that protecting something meant understanding what you were protecting and why it mattered. About Sienna, whose hands had steadied Corinth's when she was learning, whose knowledge came from 40 years of watching people live and be and finding dignity in both. About the way morning looked at the border when mist rose from the forest floor and everything was gray and silver and very still, and you could hear your own heartbeat in the silence. Lucian listened, and when he spoke, he did not talk about power or politics or the weight of ruling 7 territories. He talked about his mother, who had been a healer before she became queen, who had kept an herb garden in the private courtyard and spent her mornings there instead of in council chambers whenever she could escape. She told me once, Lucian said, his voice low enough that only Corinth could hear, that healing was not about defeating death. It was about honoring life in its time. Corinth's breath caught. Sienna says the same thing. She wrote it in her journal. Your teacher studied with my mother, before my mother married my father, when she was still just a healer traveling between territories. Lucian's eyes moved to Corinth's hands, which rested on the table between them. If Sienna taught you, you carry my mother's knowledge, whether you know it or not. I'm not trained, not really. I just learned what I could. That's more than most people with formal training ever achieve. He said it simply, without flattery, as if stating a fact. Knowledge without practice is just theory. You have practice. That makes you valuable. The word hung between them. Valuable. Not pretty, not useful, not convenient. Valuable. Corinth looked at Lucian Thorne, really looked at him. 30 years old, a widower, 12 years of ruling territories that wanted to tear themselves apart. He looked tired, she realized. Not the surface tiredness of a long day, but the deeper exhaustion of someone who had been carrying weight for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. Are you always this direct? She asked. I don't have time not to be. A pause. Does it bother you? No. And it didn't. After Dorian's smooth words and empty promises after the performance of the Great Hall, Lucian's directness felt like cold water after too much wine, sharp and clarifying. Garrett appeared beside their table with a plate of bread, golden and fragrant rosemary pressed into the crust. He set it down without ceremony. Berta's last loaf. I had to negotiate for it. Theo materialized from the other direction. He stole it. I negotiated. With theft. Corinth looked at the bread, then at Garrett's unrepentant grin, then at Lucian, who had not smiled but whose eyes carried something that might have been amusement if it were allowed to surface. Thank you, she said. Don't thank him. Theo settled into a chair across from them. Thank the woman he stole it from when she comes looking for justice. The bread was warm and slightly salty and perfect. Corinth broke off a piece and ate it slowly, and the simple pleasure of good food after a terrible night loosened something in her chest. Some tight knot that had been holding since the corridor, since Dorian's careful voice saying, "I've had to make a decision." She looked up and found Lucian watching her. Not staring, just observing with that same quality of attention he had given everything else. "What?" she said. "Nothing." But something in his expression had shifted, softened almost imperceptibly, like a room that had been closed for a long time and someone had opened a window. Across the hall, Dorian was watching them. Corinth noticed this peripherally, the way you notice movement in a forest without looking directly at it. Let him watch. Let him see what it looked like when someone asked, "Are you hurt?" instead of "How can you serve my ambitions?" The candles in the chandeliers had burned down considerably when Corinth finally rose from the table. The hall was less crowded now, the feast transitioning into private conversations and political negotiations that would last until dawn. "It's late," she said. "It is." Lucian stood when she did, the automatic courtesy of someone who had been raised to certain manners and had never abandoned them despite having the power to do whatever he wanted. "Thank you for the hour." "It was 3. "I know." Corinth looked at him, this man who had asked her name in a corridor and then sat with her for 3 hours without demanding anything, without expecting anything, just being present in a way that made the warmth in her hands feel less like warning and more like recognition. "Thank you for 3 hours. "Your quarters," Lucian said, and his voice had shifted again, becoming more formal, but not cold. "They're in the East Wing." It was not a question. He knew. Of course he knew. An Alpha King knew where everyone slept in his court. "Yes." "The fireplace doesn't work properly. It smokes." Corinth blinked. "How did you—" "I know this castle. I know which rooms have problems." He paused, choosing his words with the same care he had shown all evening. "That will be addressed tomorrow." "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to. I'm choosing to." His eyes held hers at direct and unwavering. "Sleep well, Corinth Ashwood," from nowhere in particular. She left the great hall with Cassia and Eloin, who had maintained their vigil near the walls for the entire 3 hours. Neither of them said anything as they walked through the corridors toward the East Wing, but Corinth could feel their thoughts like pressure against her skin. It was only when they reached their room that Cassia finally spoke. "The Alpha King moved your conversation to 3 hours. I noticed. And he's fixing our fireplace. Apparently." "Corinth." Cassia sat on the bed, her face serious in the lamplight. "Do you understand what's happening?" "No." Corinth removed her shoes, her fingers working automatically. "I don't understand any of it. I came here for Dorian. Dorian chose someone else. And then a man I don't know asked if I was hurt, and I stayed for 3 hours because—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Because something in you recognized something in him," Eloin said quietly from the window where she stood looking out at the courtyard. "Because sometimes life doesn't ask permission before it rearranges itself. I don't believe in fate. You don't have to believe in it for it to happen." Eloin turned from the window. "Your mother didn't believe in fate either. And then she met your father and spent the rest of her life grateful that fate ignored her skepticism." Corinth lay down on the narrow bed without undressing. Through the window she could see the lights of Velmore Court, could hear the distant sounds of the feast continuing, could feel the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from emotional upheaval. Tomorrow the court assembly would convene. Tomorrow Dorian would make his formal announcement about Isolde. Tomorrow Corinth would need to decide what came next, whether she returned to the border territories with her unworn dress and her new understanding of her own poor judgment, or whether she stayed for reasons she could not yet name. She fell asleep thinking about Lucian's voice asking, "Are you hurt?" and about the warmth in her hands that had not faded even after she left his presence, and about her mother's note that had known this was coming before Corinth did. When your hands grow warm near him, you will know. She knew. She just didn't know what to do about it. Morning came with knocking. Corinth woke to the sound of someone at the door, efficient and persistent. Cassia was already up, dressed, looking like she had been awake for hours. Eloin sat by the window with the patience of someone who had learned to wait through worse things than early morning visits. The woman at the door introduced herself as Petra, one of the court's senior housekeepers. She was perhaps 50, with gray threading through dark hair and the no-nonsense bearing of someone who managed chaos for a living and did it well. "The Alpha King's instructions," Petra said without preamble. "Your quarters are being relocated. Pack your things." Relocated where? Corinth was still trying to wake up to make sense of this. The South Tower. Better rooms. Working fireplaces. Petra entered without waiting for invitation and began folding Corinth's belongings with practiced efficiency. "The king inspected them personally this morning. Seems he has opinions about guest comfort." Cassia caught Corinth's eye. See, her expression said, "This is happening." The new quarters were not large, but they were entirely different in quality. Stone walls hung with tapestries depicting forests and running wolves. A fireplace that radiated actual heat instead of smoke. A window seat with cushions that looked out over the inner courtyard where morning light turned frost into silver. Corinth stood in the middle of the room and tried to understand what this meant. Alpha Kings did not personally relocate minor guests. They did not inspect rooms for working fireplaces. They did not. He looked at you for 3 hours, Cassia said quietly, reading Corinth's thoughts as she always did. And now he's moved your room. This is not subtle. This is not anything. But even as Corinth said it, she knew it was a lie. This was something. She just didn't know what kind of something or whether she was prepared for whatever came next. A messenger arrived before noon. The court assembly would convene at midday in the Great Hall. All PAC representatives were required to attend. Guests were welcome to observe from the gallery. Corinth wore the blue dress again. The white dress stayed in the wardrobe unworn, unnecessary. She was not going to the assembly as Dorian's promised one. She was going as herself, Corinth Ashwood Healer's apprentice, border girl woman, whose hands had warmed in the presence of the Alpha King. The assembly hall was arranged differently from the feast configuration. The long tables had been removed and replaced with a semicircle of heavy chairs, each bearing the crest of a pack. At the center, raised on a stone platform, sat a single throne. Not ornate, not gilded, but unmistakably the seat of power. It was empty when Corinth entered with Cassia and Elowin. A court attendant directed them to the side gallery, a raised area with benches for observers who had no official standing. From there, Corinth could see the entire assembly, the pack leaders settling into their seats, the advisors standing behind them, the careful choreography of power arranging itself. She saw Dorian seated in the gray pine section with his father. She saw Isolde beside Lord Aldrich in the red oak position, her posture perfect, her expression serene. And then Lucian entered. The room did not fall silent because he commanded it. It fell silent because every wolf in that assembly could feel what Corinth had felt in the corridor, that particular shift in pressure that followed him, that quality of contained power that made even alphas straighten unconsciously in their seats. He wore the same black cloak from the night before, the same silver clasp at his throat. No crown, no ceremony, just himself, which was apparently more than enough. His eyes moved across the assembly as he crossed to the throne. They swept the room, once cataloging, assessing, and then they stopped. On Corinth, 3 seconds. Not long, but deliberate. The kind of 3 seconds that are not incidental, that have weight and intention. The woman beside Corinth, an older wolf from the Western Territories, leaned closer and murmured, "He has never looked at the gallery during an opening. Not once in 12 years. Corinth said nothing, but she felt the warmth of the South Tower room settle into her chest, felt the weight of those 3 seconds, felt the entire assembly notice where the Alpha King's attention had stopped. Then Lucian looked forward, and the assembly began. They addressed territorial boundaries first. Water rights between northern packs. Trade agreements that needed updating. The formal recognition of a new Alpha in the Westmarch territories after the old one retired. Corinth paid attention to all of it because the world it revealed was more intricate than she had imagined. More human in its concerns, disputes over resources, concerns about safety, the constant negotiation between packs that had centuries of history and grudges and alliances. She was still watching when Lord Aldrich Fairchild rose from his seat. He was perhaps 55 broad through the shoulders, with silver at his temples and the particular confidence of someone who had never questioned his own importance. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the hall. There is a matter that concerns the stability of this court and these territories. Aldrich paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The question of succession has been raised repeatedly by the Eastern packs. We have been patient. We have waited while the Alpha King grieved his loss and found his footing. But 12 years is enough time. The territories need assurance. They need to know there is an heir. They need to know there is a mate. The hall was very still. Lucian looked at Aldrich with an expression that revealed nothing. The matter, he said, his voice level and carrying none of the heat Aldrich had held, is being addressed. With respect, my lord, intentions are not the same as actions. The Eastern packs asked respectfully for proof, for a timeline, for a formal commitment that this court will have the stability of succession. Aldrich was not challenging, not quite, but he was pushing, testing boundaries, using the language of concern to mask what Corinth recognized as a power play. Lucian rose from the throne. He did not need to rise. He could have delivered his response from his seat, and it would have carried the same weight. but he stood and the gesture transformed the moment from conversation to declaration. Elder Aldrich raises a fair concern. The territories deserve stability. They deserve assurance. Lucian's eyes moved across the assembly, touching each pack representative. But they also deserve a leader who makes decisions with wisdom, not haste, who chooses a mate for the right reasons, not political pressure. Of course, my lord, but I am not finished. Lucian's voice did not rise. It did not need to. The authority in those 4 words was absolute. Aldrich sat down. The matter of succession is indeed being addressed, Lucian continued, but it will be addressed in a way that honors both tradition and fairness, because some in this assembly may question whether a woman from outside the established pack, lines a woman without title or territory, could be worthy of consideration. His eyes moved deliberately back to Corinth in the gallery. I propose a trial period, a formal testing witnessed by this council that will demonstrate capability and worth beyond bloodline. The assembly erupted, not into chaos but into the controlled tumult of political bodies when something unexpected happens. Pack leaders leaned toward their advisors. Voices rose in urgent conversation. Aldrich stood again. What kind of testing? Tests of her choosing. Lucian's eyes were still on Corinth, and in them she saw something she had not expected: apology. He was doing this publicly without asking her first, and he knew it was wrong even as he did it. Not combat, not pack politics she has not studied, but the skills she brings to this court: healing, community building, the wisdom that comes from living at the edges and understanding what the center often forgets. And if she fails these tests, then the council may proceed with its recommendations for my mate. But if she succeeds, Lucian turned back to face the assembly, then bloodline objections will be set aside, and the territories will accept what I have already decided. Corinth's hands were gripping the bench beneath her. Cassia's hand found hers squeezed hard. Elwyn sat perfectly still, her face unreadable. The council voted. It took less time than it should have. 6 packs in favor, 1 opposed Aldrich. The tests were approved. 3 tests, 60 days total. The terms would be formalized by tomorrow. Lucian declared the assembly concluded. Pack leaders rose, began filing out conversations already starting about what this meant, what it changed, who this border woman was that the Alpha King was willing to publicly stake his authority on. Corinth sat in the gallery and tried to breathe. She had come to Velmore Court expecting to be publicly announced as Dorian's chosen. Instead, she had been publicly rejected by Dorian and publicly claimed in a way by the Alpha King. And now she had 60 days to prove something she did not fully understand to people who had no reason to want her to succeed. We should go, Cassia said quietly, but before they could move, a court attendant appeared. The Alpha King requests your presence. Private council chamber, immediately. The private council chamber was smaller than Corinth expected, more study than throne room. Bookshelves lined 3 walls filled with volumes that looked read rather than decorative. A large table dominated the center map spread across its surface, showing the territories in careful detail. Lucian stood by the window, his back to the door when Corinth entered. Garrett and Theo flanked the entrance, their presence more protective than threatening. You asked to see me, Corinth said. Lucian turned. Up close, without the assembly watching, he looked different. Younger somehow, more uncertain. I should have asked first. Yes, you should have. I knew Aldrich was going to push today. I knew he had something planned, and when he stood up, I had to make a choice: let him control the narrative or take control myself. Lucian crossed to the table, his hands bracing against its edge. I chose wrong. I chose to act without your consent, and I am sorry for that. The apology surprised her. Men with power did not apologize. They justified, they explained, they moved forward without looking back. They did not stand in private chambers and admit fault to women who had no leverage over them. What are the terms of these tests? Corinthos asked. Your choice. That was not political theater, I meant it. Lucian looked up at her. You tell me what you can offer this court. What skills you have that would make you valuable beyond bloodline and politics. And we design tests around those skills. And if I fail to, then Aldrich and the council proceed with their recommendations. Someone with proper lineage. Someone whose family can offer political alliances. Someone safe. His voice carried something that might have been resignation or might have been exhaustion. And you go home to the border territories with my gratitude and my regret. And if I succeed, then you become my mate, my queen, the mother of whatever heirs come. And you spend the rest of your life in a court that does not want you surrounded by wolves who will spend years testing whether you deserve the position you claimed. It was the most honest description of queenship Corinth had ever heard. No romance, no promises of happiness, just the reality of what she would be walking into. "Why me?" she asked. Lucian was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the courtyard was busy with the aftermath of the assembly pack leaders, departing guards changing shifts, servants moving between buildings. "Because when I saw you in that corridor," he said finally, "you were standing with your shoulders back and your voice steady, despite having just been humiliated in the Great Hall. Because you spoke to me like a person instead of a title. Because," he stopped, started again. "Because I have sat in that throne room for 12 years watching powerful wolves fold under pressure, compromise their principles for advantage, perform strength while being fundamentally weak. And you, with nothing but your dignity and your honest anger, had more steel in you than any of them." Corinth looked at him, really looked at him. This man who ruled 7 territories and could not find anyone strong enough to stand beside him, who had lost his wife and child and had sealed himself away rather than risk that kind of pain again, who was now offering her a throne and a target on her back and absolutely no guarantees except that he would be honest about how difficult it would be. "I'm a healer," she said. "I know. Not a politician, not a warrior, a healer. I know plants and remedies and how to sit with people while they die because I can't save them." "Then those are your tests." Lucian straightened. "Prove that healing matters, that community matters, that there are forms of strength beyond violence and political maneuvering. The council will never accept that." "Then make them accept it." His eyes held hers. "You have 60 days. Use them." Corinth turned toward the door, then stopped. "Why are you really doing this? The truth." Lucian moved closer, not touching her, just standing near enough that she could feel his presence the way she had in the corridor. "Because the first test I failed was asking your permission before acting. The second test, the one I'm taking now, is whether I can build something with someone instead of for someone. I've been making decisions alone for 12 years. I'm tired of it. And when you walked into that corridor last night, I felt something I haven't felt in a long time." "What?" "Hope." The word was quiet, almost reluctant, like he was admitting something dangerous. "I felt hope that maybe I wasn't going to be alone forever." Corinth felt the warmth settle into her palms again, not burning, just steady, present. "I need to think," she said. "Take the time you need. And I need to go home, to the border territories, before I decide anything." Lucian nodded. "Whatever you need." Corinth left the council chamber with her head spinning and the absolute certainty that her life had just changed in ways she could not yet comprehend. Behind her, she heard Garrett's voice, low and amused. "You're playing with fire, brother." And Lucian's response, quiet but certain, "I've been cold for 12 years. They left for the border territories at dawn. Not just Corinth and Cassia and Elowen, but also Garrett, who insisted he was under orders to ensure safe passage, and Lady Marguerite, who appeared at the gates dressed for travel and announced that she was not asking permission, she was simply coming. The journey took 3 days. Marguerite and Elowen sat together in the carriage, 2 women in their 70s who had not seen each other in 40 years, rebuilding a friendship that had survived distance and time. Corinth listened to them talk about the old border conflicts, about the healing work they had both done, about the losses they had witnessed, and the small victories that made the losses bearable. "Your granddaughter has the gift," Marguerite said at one point. "I know." Elowen's voice was proud. "Her mother had it too. 3 generations. Stronger each time. The recognition in her hands. You noticed." "I notice everything." Marguerite looked at Corinth. "When did it start?" Corinth had not planned to talk about this, but these were women who understood things beyond logic, who had lived long enough to know that some truths could not be explained, only experienced. 3 months ago, when Dorian first came to the territories, I thought it was love." She paused. "It wasn't. And now it happens when I'm near the Alpha King, and it doesn't stop." The 2 older women exchanged a look. Elowen spoke first. "Your mother wrote you a note about the gift." "I found it in Sienna's journal. She wrote me a letter too, before she died." Elowen's voice carried the weight of old grief long carried. "She said the gift skips some generations, strengthens in others. She said when you found him, whoever he was, you would know because your healer magic would recognize his need before your heart did." "What need?" "The need to be healed." Marguerite's voice was gentle. "Lucian has been wounded. Not his body, his spirit. He has ruled well, but he has ruled alone, and loneliness is its own kind of wound. They arrived at the border village to find it preparing for something worse than loneliness. Sienna's illness had accelerated. She lay in her bed in the healing house, thin and pale, struggling to breathe. The village healer, who had replaced her temporarily, a young man named Carrick, stood helplessly beside the bed. "I've tried everything in her journals," Carrick said when Corinth entered. "Nothing helps. The wasting just continues." Corinth knelt beside Sienna's bed. The older woman's eyes opened, focused slowly. "You came back." "Of course I came back." Corinth took Sienna's hand. It was cold, so cold. "I'm going to heal you. Border healers can't cure wasting sickness. You know that." "Then I'll find someone who can." Sienna managed a small smile. "That's my girl. Stubborn to the end." The next 7 days were a blur. Corinth worked through her mother's old journals, through Sienna's 40 years of notes, through every text and scroll the border territories had. She consulted with Carrick, with the village elder, who remembered old remedies, with Elowen and Marguerite, who had seen variations of wasting sickness before. Nothing worked. On the 8th day, Marguerite made a suggestion. "There's an herb that grows in Velmore Court's royal gardens. Moon petal. It only blooms in quartz soil, something about the minerals. My friend Lucian's mother, she used it in her most complex healing rituals." "Can you get it?" Corinth asked. "I can do better. I can show you how to use it." Marguerite pulled out a small journal of her own, decades old. "But it requires a ritual, old magic, 3 generations of healer blood working together." Elowen understood first. "Corintha's mother is dead, but she left something behind, something that carries her essence." Marguerite looked at Corinth. "The wedding dress fabric. You used it for your white dress." The ritual took place on the 15th day. In Sienna's room, with candles burning, and the village gathered outside in silent witness. 3 generations present, Elowen alive and strong. Corinth's mother present in spirit through the white dress fabric that Corinth had finally unpacked, had finally found a use for. And Corinth herself, 23 years old, with hands that grew warm when healing was needed. The moon petal brought by Garrett, who had ridden hard for 2 days to retrieve it from the court gardens, glowed softly in the candlelight. Marguerite spoke the old words, the ones passed down through healer lines, the ones that belonged to a time before pacts and territories and political courts. Corinth's hands grew hot, not uncomfortable but intense, like touching something holy. She placed them over Sienna's heart, over her lungs, over the places where the wasting had taken deepest root. The heat flowed from her hands into Sienna's body. She could feel it, feel the magic moving, seeking, finding the illness, and burning it away like frost under sun. Elowen's hands covered Corinth's, adding her strength, her years, her wisdom. The white dress fabric laid across Sienna's chest glowed with the same soft light as the moon petal, her mother's essence present in helping completing the circle of 3 generations. Time stopped having meaning. The ritual could have lasted minutes or hours. Corinth only knew that when it ended, when the light faded and her hands cooled, Sienna was breathing easier. It took 4 more days for the full effect to manifest. But on the 19th day since they arrived, Sienna sat up in bed, asked for food, and told Corinth to stop hovering because she was perfectly fine and there was work to be done. The village celebrated that night. Not loudly, border folk did not celebrate loudly. But there was music and food, in the particular warmth of a community that had nearly lost something precious and had gotten it back against all odds. Corinth had sat outside the healing house with Elowen and Marguerite, 3 generations of healers in their own way, watching the celebration. "You'll pass the first test," Marguerite said. "The council asked for proof of healing skill. You just cured something considered incurable. With help." Corinth gestured to the 2 older women. "I couldn't have done it alone." "That's the point," Elowen's voice was firm. "Healing isn't about individual power. It's about community, about generations working together, about using every resource you have, including the ones that came before you. Will the council understand that?" "They will if you explain it correctly." Marguerite stood, joints creaking. "Come, we return to Velmore tomorrow. You have 40 more days and 2 more tests, and I suspect Lord Aldrich is not going to make the next ones as straightforward as this one." They left the border territories on the 21st day. Sienna stood at the edge of the village to see them off, stronger than she had been in months, planning to train the next generation of healers with the time she had been given. "You gave me something," Sienna said to Corinth before they departed. "Not just more time. The knowledge that what I've learned won't die with me. That's worth more than years." Corinth embraced her teacher, this woman who had shown her how to heal bodies and how to sit with death when bodies could not be healed. "Thank you for sending me to the court, for pushing me to go. Thank you for coming back." Sienna pulled away, looked Corinth in the eye. "Now go be a queen and teach them that healing matters more than conquest." The return journey was faster. They pushed hard, arriving at Velmore Court on the 28th day of the 60 allowed. Word of Sienna's healing had traveled ahead of them. Border folk talked to travelers. Travelers talked at inns. And by the time Corinth rode through the gates, half the court knew what had happened. The other half learned it at the assembly 3 days later, when Marguerite presented testimony, when Garrett verified the healing with his own witness account, when Corinth explained the ritual and the 3 generations in the moon petal that only grew in court soil. Border magic and court magic working together, Corinth said to the assembled council. That's what healed Sienna, not one or the other. Both. Aldrich listened to all of it with an unreadable expression. When it came time to vote on whether the first test had been passed, he voted yes. But his eyes held something that made Corinth's hands tingle with warning instead of healing magic. 2 tests remain, Aldrich said after the vote concluded, and I confess I am eager to see what comes next. That night, Corinth stood in the South Tower room, the one Lucian had moved her to, the one with the working fireplace and the window that looked over the courtyard. Cassia had fallen asleep reading in the chair by the fire. Elowin had gone to have dinner with Marguerite, 2 old women savoring their renewed friendship. Corinth was alone when the knock came. She opened the door to find Isolde Fairchild standing in the corridor. "May I come in?" Isolde asked. They sat by the fire, 2 women who had never chosen to be enemies, but had been positioned as such by circumstances and men's decisions. Isolde looked different outside the formal court settings, younger, more uncertain. "My father is planning something," Isolde said without preamble. "For your second test?" "What kind of something?" "I don't know the details. He doesn't tell me everything anymore, not since I saw what he did to Dorian forcing that alliance." Isolde's hands twisted in her lap. "But I know it involves the Eastern Pax, and I know he believes you'll fail it." "Why are you telling me this?" Isolde looked up and her eyes were tired. "Because I've watched my father manipulate people my entire life. I've watched him use contracts and leverage and fear to control everything around him. And I'm tired of it. I'm tired of being his tool. So help me. I am helping you. I'm warning you." Isolde stood. "The second test is about building community. Yes, proving you can unite the territories. That's what the council proposed. Then be prepared for resistance. Organize resistance. My father will make sure of it." Isolde moved toward the door, then paused. "I hope you succeed, truly, because if you do, maybe the rest of us can stop pretending we have no choices." After Isolde left, Corinth sat by the fire and tried to understand what was happening. The first test had been about healing one person. The second test apparently would be about healing divisions between territories. And Aldrich Fairchild was going to do everything in his power to make sure those divisions stayed open. Somewhere in the castle, Lucian Thorne was likely working late in his study, managing the endless demands of 7 territories, carrying the weight alone as he had for 12 years. Corinth thought about 3 generations of women working together to heal Sienna, about border magic and court magic uniting, about the possibility that maybe strength did not have to mean standing alone. Tomorrow the second test would begin, and whatever Aldrich had planned, whatever resistance waited, Corinth would face it the same way she had faced everything else, with her shoulders back and the growing certainty that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. Especially then. The second test began on the 32nd day. The council convened in the morning, formal and proper, with all 12 pack representatives present. Aldrich stood to present the terms, and Corinth noticed the way he smiled as he spoke, not cruel but confident. The smile of someone holding cards no one else could see. "The first test demonstrated individual skill," Aldrich said, his voice carrying easily across the chamber. "The second test must demonstrate leadership, the ability to unite disparate groups toward a common purpose." He paused, letting the room settle into anticipation. "The candidate will establish a healing academy here at Velmore Court. She will recruit students from all 7 core territories and the 5 outer territories. She will train them together, breaking the tradition of separate territorial healing schools. And she will do this within 20 days. 20 days. Not the 40 that remained in the overall trial period. 20 days to build something that traditionally took years." Corinth has stood in the gallery where petitioners addressed the council. Her hands were steady, but not from calm, from anger held carefully in check. "With respect, Elder Aldrich, the timeline is generous." Aldrich's smile widened slightly. "Unless the candidate believes she cannot accomplish what she claims to value. Community, unity, healing across borders." He turned to face the council. "If she fails to recruit sufficient students, or if the academy fails to function, the second test is failed. The terms are clear." The council voted, 6 in favor, One abstention, surprisingly from the Western Pack representative who had been quiet throughout the proceedings. Aldrich's motion passed. Corinth left the chamber with Cassia and went directly to the South Tower room where Elowen was waiting. 20 days, Cassia said, pacing, to build an academy, to recruit from 12 territories, to overcome centuries of tradition about separate training. He set it up, so I'll fail, Corinth said quietly. The territorial healers won't send students. They'll see it as court interference, as losing control of their own training programs. Elowen sat by the window, her weathered hands folded in her lap. So you don't ask the territorial healers. What? You don't ask the ones in power, you ask the ones who want to learn. Elowen's eyes were sharp. Who has the most to gain from better training? The established healers who already have their positions, or the young ones who can't get training because the spots are limited and political? Corinth understood. We recruit the ones they won't teach. And you teach them anyway. Elowen stood moved to the small writing desk in the corner. Marguerite and I can reach out to the border territories. We know people, old connections, the ones who remember when healing was about helping people instead of maintaining hierarchies. What about facilities? The council denied me space in the main healing ward. Then use what you have. Cassia had stopped pacing, her organizational mind clearly working. The South Courtyard. The old stable building that's not being used. The grounds between the East Wing and the gardens. That's not proper facilities. No, but it's start, and starting matters more than perfect. That afternoon, Corinth walked the grounds with Cassia and Garrett, who had appeared without being asked and seemed determined to help whether or not his king had ordered it. The old stable, Garrett said, pushing open the heavy door. Inside, the space was dusty and filled with equipment that had not been used in years. But the structure was sound. The roof held. Light came through high windows. Could work. Would need cleaning. A lot of cleaning, Cassia amended. I'll get you people. Garrett was already calculating. Guards who are off rotation. Kitchen staff who want extra pay. We can have this cleared in 3 days. Why are you helping? Corinth asked. Garrett looked at her with eyes that were usually amused but were currently serious. Because Lucian hasn't had hope in 10 years, and you gave it back to him. That's worth a stable renovation. They worked. For 3 days they worked. Garrett brought guards and kitchen staff in stable hands who scrubbed and swept and hauled away decades of accumulated debris. Cassia organized everything with the efficiency of someone running a military campaign. Elowen and Marguerite wrote letters, dozens of them, to every contact they had in the territories. Corinth had prepared curriculum. She had never taught formally before, but she had learned from Sienna and before that from her mother's journals. She knew what needed to be taught, not just the mechanics of healing, but the philosophy, how to sit with dying patients, how to make hard choices about limited resources, how to maintain dignity when cure was not possible. On the 4th day, the first student arrived. His name was Theron. He was 67 years old from the Eastern Territories, and he had been training healers for 40 years using methods he had learned as a young man. He walked into the renovated stable with the careful bearing of someone whose joints hurt, but whose mind was still sharp. Lady Marguerite wrote to me, he said without preamble, said you were teaching the old ways alongside the new, said you believed healing should be shared, not hoarded. That's correct. Then I will teach what I know, if you will have me. Corinth felt something loosen in her chest. We will have you, gladly. On the 6th day, 6 more students arrived. Young women from the Northern Territories, none older than 25, all refused entry to their PAC's formal healing program because the spots were full, because they lacked family connections, because the established healers wanted to protect their positions. We heard you were teaching anyone, one of them said. Her name was Kira, 22, with nervous hands and determined eyes, no matter where they came from. That's true. Then teach us. On the 9th day, they had 23 students. By the 12th day, 37. They came from all over, young mothers who wanted to care for their children, better old warriors who were finished fighting and wanted to preserve life instead of taking it, wanderers who had gifts but no formal training, even 3 young men who defied the tradition that healing was women's work. And on the 15th day, Isolde Fairchild appeared at the stable door. She wore a simple dress, not the court finery Corinth had always seen her in. Her hair was pulled back practically. She carried no guards, no attendants, no markers of her status. I want to learn, Isolde said. The stable went quiet. 37 students stopped their work, stopped their conversations, watched this moment unfold. Your father, Corinth began. I am not my father. Isolde's voice was steady, clear. I am 24 years old and I have spent my entire life being told what I should be, what I should do, who I should marry for political advantage. This is the first choice I am making entirely for myself. Corinth looked at her, this woman who could have been an enemy, who had been positioned as a rival, who was now standing in a renovated stable, asking to learn. Then welcome, Corinth said. Find a seat. The word spread after that. The daughter of Lord Aldrich Fairchild was studying with the border healer. The old territorial divisions were not being honored. People who had been denied training were being taught alongside those with credentials. The academy, if it could be called that, in its stable, with its mismatched benches and its curriculum written on borrowed paper, was breaking every rule about how healing education was supposed to function. By the 18th day, they had 47 students, and they were learning, not just herb identification and wound care and the mechanics of healing. They were learning from each other. Northern Territory techniques for frostbite treatment that the Southern Territories had never seen, Eastern meditation practices that help with focus during long procedures, border efficiency methods developed from years of scarce resources. Corinth taught in the mornings. Master Theron taught in the afternoons, his 67 years of experience flowing into eager students who absorbed everything. Aloan came twice weekly to teach the oldest healing practices, the ones passed down through generations before pacts and territories existed. Marguerite taught political strategy. You will face resistance, she told the students on the 19th day, from territorial healers who feel threatened, from pack leaders who fear change. You must be better than good. You must be undeniable. On the 20th day, the council reconvened for evaluation. They came to the stable instead of calling Corinth to the assembly chamber. All 12 pack representatives, with Aldrich at the forefront, expecting to find chaos or failure or some justification for declaring the test failed. They found 47 students working in organized groups. They found Master Theron teaching advanced diagnostic techniques to a mixed class that included both a 70-year-old grandmother and a 19-year-old boy. They found Isolde Fairchild working beside a girl from the poorest border village, both of them preparing poultices with practiced efficiency. They found something that worked. Aldrich walked through the space slowly, his face betraying nothing. He stopped at various stations, asked students questions about what they were learning, observed the teaching methods. When he reached Corinth, standing near the main teaching area, he spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. You have recruited students. That was the requirement. We have. From all territories. 12 territories represented, plus 5 students from beyond the traditional 7. Corinth kept her voice level. Master Theron can verify the attendance records. I'm sure he can. Aldrich's eyes moved across the stable, calculating something. You have built a community here. In 20 days, that is notable. It's what happens when you stop asking permission and start providing value. Something flickered in Aldrich's expression, not quite respect, but awareness. The awareness that Corinth was not what he had expected, that the tests he designed might not break her the way he had assumed they would. The council voted that afternoon, 7 in favor of passing the second test. 5 opposed Aldrich, and 4 Eastern Territory representatives who clearly voted as a bloc. The test passed. Barely. But it passed. That night, Corinth sat in the South Tower room and tried to process what had happened. She had 8 days left in the 60-day trial period. 1 test remained, and Aldrich had lost twice, which meant the third test would be different, worse, designed not just to challenge her, but to destroy her. The knock at the door came late after Cassia had gone to bed, after Elowen had retired to her own adjacent room. Lucian stood in the corridor. He looked exhausted, not physically, but deeper. The exhaustion of someone who had been managing too much alone for too long. His eyes found hers, and in them, she saw something she had not seen before: vulnerability. May I come in? She stepped aside. He entered, moved to the window, stood looking out at the courtyard the way she often did. You're succeeding, he said quietly, at the test, at everything I hoped you would do. But Aldrich is planning something for the third test, something that I cannot see yet, but I can feel coming. Lucian turned to face her. He has not been this quiet before. Usually when he loses, he objects loudly, he fights openly. This time he just voted and left. What does that mean? It means he has something planned that he believes is inevitable, something he doesn't need to fight because he knows I cannot prevent it. Lucian's hands gripped the window ledge. I should never have agreed to these tests. I should have just claimed you as my mate and made the council accept it. And then what I would have been queen, yes, but I would have been the queen you imposed on them, not the one they chose to accept. Every decision I made would be questioned. Every failure would be proof that you were wrong. Corinth moved closer, though she did not touch him. These tests are hard, but they're also necessary. You sound like my mother. Then your mother was wise. Lucian looked at her, and for the first time since she met him in that corridor weeks ago, he smiled. Not fully, not freely, but a small, genuine expression that transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made her chest tighten. She would have liked you. She would have said you had steel in your spine and sense in your head, and those were the two things that mattered most in a queen. What did she say about love? The question surprised them both. Corinth had not meant to ask it, but it was there now, hanging in the air between them, unavoidable. Lucian was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. She said love was what you built, not what you found. That the butterflies and lightning of first attraction were temporary, but the decision to keep choosing someone that lasted, that endured. Did you love your wife? I did. He said it without hesitation, without guilt. Not at first. Our marriage was arranged political. But over the years, we built something real. And when she died, he started again. When she died, I lost not just her, but the possibility of that kind of partnership. I told myself I would never attempt it again. What changed? You asked me if I was always direct. I said I didn't have time not to be. Lucian's eyes held hers. The truth is, I've been direct since Natalia died because I stopped believing in things that require gentleness, hope, trust, the vulnerability of letting someone matter. And now I'm standing in your room at midnight, telling you things I have not told anyone in 10 years, and discovering that vulnerability might not be weakness after all. Corinth felt the warmth settle into her palms again, not burning, just steady, present, real. The third test begins soon, she said. Whatever Aldrich has planned, we'll face it. We. Lucian repeated the word like he was testing its weight. I have been using I for a decade. We is different. Is it good different or bad different? I don't know yet, but his smile returned small and genuine. Ask me again after you pass the third test. He left shortly after, and Corinth stood alone in the room with the growing understanding that she had entered this court expecting to be humiliated, had discovered she was stronger than she believed, and was now standing on the edge of something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Tomorrow, the third test would be announced, and whatever came, whoever she became, she would face it the way she had faced everything else since that night in the corridor, with her shoulders back and the certainty that some battles were worth fighting even when victory was not guaranteed. The third test was announced on the 53rd day, and it was worse than anything Corinth had imagined. The council convened in full assembly. Aldrich stood to present the terms, and this time there was no smile, just cold calculation. The final test, he said, is not of skill or community building. It is of leadership, of moral judgment, of the ability to make impossible choices that a queen must face. He gestured, and 3 people were brought forward into the council chamber. The first was a child, 8 years old, a girl from the poorest of the Northern Territories. She was pale, thin, barely able to stand. Beside her stood her mother, holding her upright. Wasting fever, Aldrich said. Treatable, but the medicine is expensive. More expensive than her family could afford in 3 lifetimes. The second was an older man, perhaps 65, with a wound across his chest that had been bandaged, but was clearly serious. Corinth recognized him, Aldrich's older brother, Matthias Fairchild, a retired warrior. Hunting accident, Aldrich continued. The wound will turn septic without immediate surgery, complex, requiring a skilled healer's full attention for days. The third was a woman in her 60s, noble bearing, clearly wealthy from her clothing. She lay on a stretcher, breathing shallowly. This is Lady Helena Voss, wife of Council Member Voss. Stage 4 wasting illness. Terminal. She has perhaps 2 weeks, perhaps less. The pain can be managed, or we can attempt treatments that might extend her life another month or 2, though they would cause considerable suffering. Aldrich turned to face Corinth directly. The test is simple. You have resources for 1 case, 1 patient. Your medicine stores can purchase the fever cure or the surgical supplies, but not both. Your time can be devoted to complex surgery or end-of-life care, but not both. You must choose. The chamber was silent. Corinth felt every eye on her, felt the weight of what was being asked. This was not a test of skill. This was a test designed to have no right answer, only wrong ones that would reveal her character in ways that could be used against her. Choose the child. Appear compassionate but naive, unable to honor political obligations. Choose Aldrich's brother. Appear politically calculating, currying favor at the expense of the vulnerable. Choose Lady Voss appear elitist caring more for nobles than commoners. There must be another way, Corinth said. There is not. Aldrich's voice was final. Resources are limited. Time is limited. This is the reality of leadership. Choose. Corinth looked at the three patients, at the child who could barely stand, at Matthias, who was breathing carefully through obvious pain, at Lady Voss, whose eyes were open and aware, and filled with the particular clarity that comes from knowing death is near. She thought about what Sienna had taught her, what her mother's journals had said, what the past 53 days had been building toward. I reject the premise, she said. The chamber erupted, not into case, but into the sharp inhale of hundreds of people who had not expected that response. Aldrich's expression did not change. You cannot reject the test. I can reject the assumption that scarcity is inevitable when resources exist. Korn's voice was steady, clear. The medicine for fever exists in the court's reserves. The surgical supplies exist in the healing ward. The knowledge to provide dignified end-of-life care exists in every trained healer here. The only scarcity is in the arbitrary limits you've imposed. The limits are artificial. Corinth moved forward into the center of the chamber. This test assumes leadership means choosing who suffers. I'm saying leadership means refusing to accept that anyone must suffer when solutions exist. And how exactly do you propose to treat all three? Aldrich's voice carried an edge now. With your limited time and resources, with community, with the 47 students we just trained, with Master Theron's surgical expertise, with Lady Marguerite's connections to access medicine supplies, with the entire network we've spent 40 days building. Master Corinth looked directly at Aldrich. You designed this test to be impossible alone. You're right. It is impossible alone, but I am not alone anymore. She turned to address the full council. I choose all three. The child will receive the fever medicine from my personal funds if necessary. Master Theron will perform the surgery on Matthias. He has more surgical experience than any healer in this court. And I will personally provide end-of-life care to Lady Voss because dying with dignity is not less important than living with health. This is not, Aldrich began. Elder Aldrich. The voice came from the council seats, from Lord Voss, the elderly council member, whose wife lay dying before them. Let her try. Aldrich's jaw tightened, but Lord Voss was a council member, and his wife was one of the patients. He could not be dismissed. You have 3 days, Aldrich said finally. 3 days to treat all three cases. If any of them fail, if the child worsens, if Matthias's surgery fails, if Lady Voss suffers unnecessarily, the test has failed. Understood. What followed were the longest 3 days of Corinth's life. She started with the child. The girl's name was Nora, and her mother had walked for 6 days to bring her to Velmore Court on the rumor that the border healer might help. Corinth used the last of her personal savings money, saved from years of healing work in the border territories, to purchase the fever medicine from the court's apothecary. The medicine cost more than she expected, more than seemed reasonable for something that would save a child's life. But she paid it, and she administered it herself, and she sat with Nora and her mother through that first night as the fever broke slowly, carefully, degree by degree. By the morning of the second day, Nora was sitting up asking for food color, returning to her thin face. The surgery happened on the second day. Master Theron performed it in the main healing ward with 3 of the academy students assisting. Corinth watched from the observation gallery, her hands clasped tightly as Theron's 67 years of experience guided him through the delicate work of repairing the wound in Matthias's chest. The surgery took 6 hours. When it was finished, Theron emerged looking exhausted but satisfied. He will live. Assuming infection does not set in, assuming he follows recovery protocols, he should make a full recovery within 2 months. Matthias opened his eyes in the recovery room, saw Corinth standing beside his bed, and managed a small nod. Thank you. Thank Master Theron. He did the work. He did the surgery. You made it possible. Matthias's voice was weak but clear. My brother expected you to choose politically, to choose me to gain favor with our family. Instead, you chose all of us. That takes courage. But it was the third case that tested Corinth most deeply. Lady Helena Voss was dying. There was no cure, no treatment that would give her more than days of extra suffering. What remained was to make those days bearable, to give her the dignity of a peaceful end. Corinth spent the third day at Lady Voss's bedside. Not treating her there was nothing to treat, but being present. Listening as Helena spoke about her life, her children, the things she regretted and the things she was grateful for. Managing her pain with careful doses of medicine that dulled the worst edges without stealing her lucidity. Lord Voss sat on the other side of the bed holding his wife's hand. They had been married for 43 years, Corinth learned. They had raised 5 children together, buried 2 celebrated grandchildren. They had built a life. "I don't want more time," Helena said to Corinth, late on the third evening. Her voice was soft but certain. "I want peace. Can you give me that?" "I can." Mona Corinth adjusted the medicine, the dosage carefully calculated to ease suffering without hastening death. Align healers learned to walk through experience and instinct. Helena closed her eyes. "Thank you for not trying to save me, for understanding that sometimes healing means letting go." She died as dawn broke on the 4th day, peacefully without pain, with her husband holding one hand and Corinth holding the other. Lord Voss wept quietly for a moment. Then he looked at Corinth with red eyes and said, "You gave her what she asked for, what she needed. That is true healing." The council reconvened that afternoon. Aldrich stood to evaluate the test results. "The child lives," confirmed. "The surgery was successful," confirmed. "Lady Voss died." "Lady Voss died peacefully." Lord Voss interrupted, standing from his seat. "She died without suffering. She died with dignity. And in her final hours, she told me that the border healer understood something. Most healers forget that death is not failure when it comes with peace." He turned to address the full council. "I vote that the third test is passed, and I formally request that this council stop trying to find ways to reject this woman and start accepting that she has proven herself in every way that matters." The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then another council member stood, and another, until 5 of them were standing, signaling their support. Aldrich remained seated. "There is still the matter of proper lineage, of bloodline, of nothing that matters more than what we have witnessed." This from the Western Territory representative, the one who had abstained from earlier votes. "The candidate has demonstrated healing skill beyond question. She has built community where division existed. She has made moral choices that honored life in all its stages." "What more do you require, Elder Aldrich?" "The stability of succession requires someone strong enough to lead, which she has proven to be." The Western representative's voice was firm. "I move that we vote immediately on whether all 3 tests have been passed." The vote was called, 8 in favor, 3 opposed Aldrich, and 2 Eastern Territory representatives who had voted with him throughout. The tests were passed, all 3. 56 days into the 60-day trial period, Corinth Ashwood had done what Aldrich designed to be impossible. But before anyone could celebrate, before the chamber could erupt into the chaos of political recalculation, Aldrich stood one final time. "The tests are passed. I acknowledge this." His voice was measured, controlled. "However, there remains one legal matter that must be addressed before any bonding can proceed." He pulled a document from inside his robe, yellowed with age, clearly official. 12 years ago, Queen Natalia signed a betrothal contract while pregnant with the heir. The contract states that any child born of her line must marry into the Fairchild family, specifically to my daughter Isolde, should the child be male, or to a designated Fairchild heir, should the child be female. The chamber went silent again, but this was a different silence. Shocked, horrified. Lucian rose from his throne. "What contract? I knew nothing of this." The contract was signed in private under the advisement of the council at that time, for political stability, for securing the Eastern Territory's loyalty. Aldrich's voice was cold now, the pretense of concern dropped. "The contract is legally binding under old territorial law. Queen Natalia died before she could inform you, but the obligation remains." "The child died with her," Lucian said, his voice barely controlled fury. "The contract specified any heir of Natalia's line, any future heir. Any child born to you, regardless of who the mother is bound by this contract." Aldrich turned to the council. "The Alpha King may marry whomever he wishes, but his firstborn child belongs to the Fairchild line." The implications crashed through the chamber like a wave. Corinth felt them hit her physically, the realization that even if she became Lucian's mate, even if she passed every test any child they had, would be bound from birth to a contract made before either of them knew it existed. "This is coercion," Marguerite said from her seat in the observer's gallery. "Natalia would never have signed this willingly." "Prove it." Aldrich's challenge was simple, devastating. "The Queen is dead." The council members who witnessed the signing are dead. All that remains is the contract itself, signed in her hands, sealed with her seal. Unless you have evidence of coercion, the contract stands. The session ended in chaos. Lucian stormed from the chamber. Aldrich left with his daughter, who looked pale and stricken. The council dissolved into urgent conversations about precedent in law and political ramifications. Corinth stood in the center of it all and felt the weight of what had just happened. She had passed 3 impossible tests. She had proven herself in every way demanded. And it meant nothing because a dead queen's signature on an old contract had bound the future in ways no one could break. That night, she sat in the South Tower room with Eloin, Cassia, and Marguerite. They had not bothered with candles. The moonlight through the window was enough. There must be a way, Cassia said. She had been saying variations of this for hours, her organizational mind refusing to accept an impossible problem. Legal contracts can be challenged. There must be precedent, loopholes, something. The contract requires proof of coercion, Marguerite said quietly. Without that, it stands. Did Natalia write to you about this? Corinth asked. After the signing, did she say anything? She wrote to me often. Hundreds of letters over the years we were friends. Marguerite's voice was heavy. I kept them all, but I would need to search through them to see if any mentioned the pressure she was under the circumstances of the signing. Then search. Corinth had stood, moved to the window, looked out at the courtyard where she had first walked with Lucian, after the rejection, after the corridor, after everything changed. We have 4 days left. Use them. Eloin spoke for the first time in hours. What will you do? I'm going to find Isolde Fairchild, because her father thinks he's won, but he forgot something important. Corinth turned from the window. Isolde is not her father, and she's been defying him in small ways since she joined the academy. Maybe she's ready to defy him in bigger ones. She found Isolde in the Healing Academy stable. It was late past midnight, but Isolde sat alone among the benches where students studied during the day. She was not crying, she was just sitting very still, looking at nothing. I didn't know, Isolde said when Corinth entered. About the contract, my father never told me. I know. He wants to use me, again. Like he used me with Dorian, like he's used me my entire life. Isolde's voice was flat, exhausted. I thought joining your academy was choosing something for myself. But even that becomes a tool for him. If you marry Lucian, if you have children, they're bound to me or to whatever Fairchild heir my father designates. Which means I'm still not free. I'm still just a piece in his game. Corinth sat beside her on the bench. Outside, the night was cold and clear stars visible through the high windows. What would freedom look like to you? Corinth asked. I don't know. I've never had it long enough to imagine. Isolde looked at her hands. I wanted to learn healing because it was the first thing that felt like mine. Like I was building something instead of being built by someone else's expectations. And now even that is contaminated. It doesn't have to be. Halbuji, help me break the contract. Testify against it. You know your father's methods better than anyone. You know how he manipulates situations, pressures, people, creates leverage. Tell the council what you know. Isolde was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was small, uncertain. He's my father. I know. If I testify against him, he'll disown me. The Fairchild family will cut me off. I'll have nothing. No home, no resources, no protection. You'll have yourself. Corinth held Isolde at his gaze. And you'll have the knowledge that you broke a cycle, that you refused to be his tool, that you chose freedom even when it cost everything. That's easy for you to say. You've always been free. No. Corinth shook her head. I was free from wealth, from status, from power. But I wasn't free from fear of not being enough, from believing I needed someone else's validation to matter. It took being publicly rejected in that great hall to understand that the only person whose validation I needed was my own. Isolde looked at her, really looked at her, and something in her face shifted. If I do this, if I testify, what happens to me after? I don't know, but you'll face it as yourself, not as your father's daughter, and that has to be worth something. They sat together in the stable for another hour. Two women who had been positioned as rivals, talking about freedom and fear and the cost of choosing yourself when everyone expects you to choose duty. When Isolde left, she said only, I'll think about it. It was not a promise, but it was not a refusal either. The next 3 days were a blur of desperate research. Marguerite went through every letter Queen Natalia had written looking for any mention of pressure, coercion, fear. Cassia researched territorial law looking for precedents where contracts were overturned. Garrett quietly investigated the old council members who had witnessed the signing, trying to find living relatives who might know something. Corinth continued teaching at the academy because the students needed her, because stopping would be giving up, because the work mattered regardless of what happened with contracts and courts. On the 58th day, Marguerite found something. A letter dated 1 week before Natalia signed the contract. In it, the late queen wrote, "They tell me that if I do not sign, they will ensure the child never inherits. They say accidents happen, that succession can be managed. I am so afraid, Marguerite. Not for myself, but for this baby who has not yet drawn breath. What kind of mother signs her child's future away to protect them? What kind of queen bows to threats?" It was not explicit. It was not a confession of coercion in legal terms. But it was evidence. It was proof that Natalia signed under duress, under implied threats to her unborn child. They presented it to the council on the 59th day. The hearing was formal, legal, unlike anything that had come before. This was not about tests or proving worth. This was about contracts and precedent and the careful navigation of laws that had governed the territories for centuries. Marguerite testified, presenting the letter explaining the context. Garrett presented his findings about the old council members, 3 of whom had been investigated for various abuses of power in the years before they died. Lord Voss spoke about his own knowledge of Natalia's state of mind during that pregnancy, how frightened she had been, how isolated. And then Isolde Fairchild stood. She walked to the center of the chamber alone without her father's permission. When she spoke, her voice was steady in a way it had never been before. "I have watched my father manipulate contracts my entire life. I have watched him use legal language to hide coercion, to turn threats into agreements, to make people believe they were choosing when they had no choice at all." She pulled out papers of her own documents Corinth had not known existed. "These are correspondence between my father and the old council members. Letters discussing how to secure the Thorne succession through contracts that would bind future heirs. Letters that explicitly reference applying appropriate pressure to Queen Natalia." The chamber erupted. Aldrich stood, his face dark with fury. "Where did you get those?" "From your private study, 2 nights ago." Isolde did not look at him. "I am breaking from the House Fairchild, publicly and permanently. And I am submitting this evidence to invalidate a contract that was built on coercion and fear." The vote was called immediately. Motion to nullify the contract based on proven coercion. 9 votes in favor, 2 opposed. 1 abstention, Aldrich's closest ally, who clearly saw which way the wind was blowing. The contract was nullified. Aldrich left the chamber in silence, his power broken not by force but by his own daughter's courage. Isolde stood alone in the center of the room as PAC representatives filed out, discussing what this meant for succession, for politics, for the territories. Corinth approached her. "You sacrificed everything." "No," Isolde's eyes were clear, bright. "I sacrificed security, but I gained myself. That's not nothing." "What will you do now?" "I don't know. For the first time in my life, I have no plan, no obligation, no path laid out by someone else." Isolde smiled, and it was the first genuine smile Corinth had ever seen on her face. "It's terrifying, and it's wonderful." There was 1 day left in the 60-day trial period. The tests were passed, the contract was nullified. Nothing remained except the question that had been building since that first night in the corridor. Would Corinth become Lucian's mate? She found him in the royal gardens on the 60th evening. The gardens his mother had planted, that he maintained himself, where he had first invited Corinth after the rejection. The herbs were winter, dormant, brown, and quiet, waiting for spring. "It's done," he said when she approached. "The contract is broken. The tests are passed. The obstacles are removed." "Yes." "And yet you look uncertain." Corinth sat on the stone bench in the center of the garden. Lucian remained standing, giving her space, not crowding, always respecting boundaries. "I came to Velmore Court expecting to be announced as someone's chosen one. Someone else's validation. Someone else's decision about my worth." She looked up at him. "And instead I discovered I was worth more than I believed. That I could build something that mattered. That I didn't need someone to choose me, I needed to choose myself." "And have you chosen yourself?" "Yes." The word was certain, clear. "Which is why I need to ask you something. If I do this, if I become your queen, am I choosing myself, or am I just trading one validation for another?" Lucian was quiet for a long moment. Then he sat beside her on the bench, close enough to talk quietly, but not touching, not assuming. "I have been alone for 10 years. By choice, by grief, by the belief that I was safer that way." His voice was low, honest. "And then you appeared in a corridor, and you were angry and dignified and entirely yourself. And I realized I did not want to be safe anymore. I wanted to be alive." He turned to face her. "But I do not want to be the thing that defines you. I do not want to be the validation you seek or the rescue you accept. He paused, choosing words carefully. I want to build something together. Not have you fit into what I need, but discover what we could create that neither of us could make alone. That's terrifying. I know. His small smile returned. My mother said love was what you built, not what you found. She said the butterflies and lightning were temporary, but the decision to keep choosing each other that lasted. Is that what you're offering, the choice I'll have to keep making? Every day, consciously, deliberately. He held her gaze. I am asking if you are willing to build something with me. Not for me, with me. Corinth felt the warmth settle into her palms one final time, not magic responding to need but recognition of choice, of partnership, of the possibility that maybe love was exactly what Lucian's mother had said not found but built. I'm willing, she said. The bonding ceremony was held 10 days later on the first warm evening of early spring. They did not wait for elaborate planning for perfect conditions. They simply decided and it happened. The ceremony took place in Queen Natalia's garden, where Lucian had first asked Corinth to stay beyond 1 hour. The herbs were beginning to show green shoots, new growth pushing through dead winter stalks. The iron lanterns that had lit the informal feast hung from the garden arches, now casting warm light over assembled witnesses. Not the full court, not all 12 territories. Just the people who mattered, Elowen and Marguerite sitting together, two elders who had witnessed more than most and had learned to savor what came after survival. Cassia standing as Corinth's witness, holding the simple crown of spring flowers that would rest on Corinth's head. Garrett and Theo flanking Lucian brothers in everything but blood. Master Theron and several academy students. Lord Voss alone now, but present to honor what Corinth had given his wife in her final hours. Isolde, who had rebuilt herself in the past 10 days, who was establishing an independent holding in the Western Territories where she would fund healing education for those who could not afford it otherwise. And the pack representatives, those who had voted to support Corinth through the test. Not all 12, but enough. Marguerite conducted the ceremony as the senior elder present who had loved Queen Natalia and now loved Natalia's son. She spoke of partnership, of choosing to build rather than simply exist, of the courage required to be vulnerable in a world that rewarded armor. There were 4 candles lit during the ritual. One for Lucian's mother, the healer queen, who had taught him that strength came in many forms. One for his father, who had ruled with justice. One for Corinth's mother, whose gift had passed through generations. One for her father, who had taught her that protection meant understanding what mattered. The vows were simple, not elaborate promises about forever, just honest commitments about now. Lucian spoke first. I vow to see you as you are, not as I need you to be. To make space for your growth, not confine you to my comfort. To build with you, not for you. Corinth's voice was steady. I vow to stand with you, not behind you. To share burdens, not bear them alone. To choose you consciously every day, knowing that love is built and not simply found. They exchanged rings, simple bands, no elaborate jewels, symbols of choice rather than possession. When Marguerite pronounced them bonded, when the witnesses began to applaud, Lucian did not immediately kiss Corinth the way ceremonial traditions suggested. He looked at her for a moment, really looked, and said quietly enough that only she could hear. Thank you for teaching me that hope was not dangerous, that opening doors did not guarantee pain. Thank you for asking if I was hurt, she replied, for seeing me before you knew what I could offer. Then he kissed her, and it was gentle and brief and entirely appropriate for a ceremony. But in that kiss was the promise of all the kisses to come, all the choices they would make, all the ways they would build what neither could create alone. The celebration lasted until dawn, simple and warm, with food from Berta's kitchen and music from village players, and the particular joy of people who have witnessed something worth witnessing. Corinth danced with her grandmother, who whispered, your mother would be so proud, not because you became a queen, but because you became yourself. She danced with Cassia, who said nothing but held her tight and let tears fall freely. She danced with Lucian, who was not a particularly graceful dancer, but who tried anyway, and whose laughter when they stumbled was worth more than perfect technique. And when the dawn came, when the celebration wound down and people drifted away to their own lives, Corinth stood in the garden with the Lucian and watched the sun rise over Velmore Court. What happens now, she asked. Now we build. Lucian's arm was around her shoulders, casual and comfortable. The Healing Academy continues. The territories learn to work together instead of competing. We rule together, we make mistakes together, we figure it out as we go. That's not very reassuring. No, but it's honest. They stood together as morning light turned the courtyard silver, as the castle woke around them, as life continued the way it always did, with work and challenge, and the constant negotiation of living among others. But now they faced it together, and that made all the difference. 4 years later, on a spring morning, very much like the one where they had bonded, Corinth woke to sunlight streaming through the windows of the royal chambers and the sound of her daughter's laughter echoing from the courtyard below. She rose from the bed, careful not to wake Lucian, and moved to the window seat that had become her favorite place in all of Velmore Court. The view looked out over the Healing Academy grounds, no longer housed in the converted stable, but in a proper building with classrooms and dormitories, and a medicinal garden that Elowen tended with fierce pride. Below, Rowena was chasing butterflies across the courtyard grass. 2 years old, with her father's dark hair and her mother's steady gaze and an alarming tendency to try to heal every injured creature she encountered. Cassia sat on a bench nearby, watchful, but not hovering, allowing the child her freedom while keeping her safe. Corinth rested one hand on the curve of her belly, 4 months pregnant with their second child. She had not planned the timing carefully, but she had learned that some things could not be controlled or scheduled. Some things simply happened and you adjusted. The Healing Academy had grown beyond anything she had imagined that first desperate day in the stable. 12 branches now spread across all the territories. More than 200 students learning together, teaching each other as much as they learned from instructors. The territorial divisions had not disappeared. Centuries of history did not erase in 4 years, but they had softened in ways that mattered. The Elders' Council had become a permanent fixture of court governance, giving voice to those who had survived long enough to have earned wisdom. Elowen led it at 74, still sharp, still formidable, still teaching twice weekly at the academy. Marguerite served alongside her, writing political memoirs between council sessions, mentoring young women who needed to see that strength and relevance did not fade with age. Sienna visited from the border territories twice yearly, healthy and vital, training the next generation of healers with the time Corinth had given her. Master Theron had retired from active teaching, but remained as the academy's philosophical heart, the one students sought when they faced impossible choices. The door opened quietly. Lucian entered, carrying 2 cups of tea, one of which he handed to Corinth before settling beside her on the window seat. "You're up early," he said. "Rowena woke me. She's very loud for someone so small." "She gets that from you." "I'm not loud. You're not quiet either, especially when the council disagrees with you." But he was smiling as he said it, and Corinth found herself smiling back. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching their daughter play, watching the academy students cross the courtyard toward morning classes. In 4 years, this had become their morning ritual: tea in the window seat, quiet conversation before the demands of governance began. "The Western territories are pushing again," Lucian said, "about expanding trade routes through the mountains. Let them push. Isolde's been managing those negotiations better than anyone else could. She'll find the solution." Isolde had indeed found her calling. After breaking from House Fairchild, she had established herself in the Western Territories, funding healing education and managing trade agreements with a combination of fierce intelligence and hard-won empathy. She visited monthly, always bringing stories of lives changed by access to learning. She and Corinth had become genuine friends, not the rivals men had tried to make them, but women who recognized in each other the courage it took to choose yourself. "Cassia wants to expand the archives," Corinth said. "She thinks we need better record-keeping for cross-territorial law." "Cassia is always right about organizational matters. Tell her yes." Cassia had married a quiet court administrator named Willem 2 years ago. They had no children yet, but they had adopted 3 dogs who required schedules and routines and elaborate systems of management that Cassia provided with obvious delight. A knock at the door interrupted them. Petra entered, efficient as always. "Council meets in 2 hours. The Eastern delegation arrived early. They're already in the reception hall. And the new academy students from the outer territories are here for orientation. Master Theron asked if the Queen might address them." "Tell Theron I'll be there in an hour." Corinth set down her tea. "And tell the Eastern delegation I'll join them shortly. They can wait." After Petra left, Lucian looked at Corinth with an expression that was half amusement, half pride. 4 years ago, you would have apologized for making them wait. 4 years ago, I didn't understand that making people wait can be its own kind of teaching. They learn patience. I establish boundaries. Everyone benefits. My mother would have loved you. You've said that before. Because it's true." Lucian stood, pulling her gently to her feet. "And because watching you become exactly who you were always meant to be has been the greatest privilege of my life." Corinth felt the familiar warmth spread through her chest. Not magic, not fate, but choice. 4 years of daily choosing, of building something together that neither could have created alone. "We should get Rowena," she said, before she tries to heal another butterfly, and it flies away thinking it's been attacked. They descended to the courtyard together, collected their daughter, listened to her excited explanation about the butterfly that had so many colors, mama, so many. Cassia joined them for breakfast in the small dining room reserved for family, and they talked about ordinary things. Rowena's tendency to sing to injured plants, the new curriculum being developed for advanced students, Willem's ongoing battle with the archive's filing system. Later, Corinth stood before 40 new Academy students' faces from territories that had never sent students before, young people who had heard about the Healer Queen, who taught that learning belonged to everyone, not just the privileged few. "Some of you traveled weeks to get here," Corinth said to the assembled students. "Some of you were told you weren't good enough, weren't the right family, weren't worth training. I know, because I heard the same things." She paused, looking at the faces before her, nervous, hopeful, determined. "Here, those things don't matter. What matters is that you showed up, that you want to learn, that you believe healing is worth doing even when it's hard, even when resources are scarce, even when you can't save everyone." She thought about Sienna teaching her in the border village, about her mother's patterns sewn into a white dress, about 3 generations of women working together to cure a wasting sickness. "You are not alone in this," Corinth continued. "You have each other. You have teachers who remember what it was like to be where you are. And you have a court that understands finally that strength comes in many forms. Healing is one of them." Master Theron stepped forward to begin the formal orientation, and Corinth slipped away to prepare for the council meeting. But as she walked through the academy halls past classrooms, where students from 5 different territories studied together, past the herb garden, where Elowin was teaching 3 elderly students about ancient remedies, past a notice board covered with success stories and requests for help, she felt the weight of what they had built. Not perfect, not finished, but real, growing, changing lives. The council meeting was routine trade negotiations, resource allocation, minor territorial disputes that were resolved through conversation rather than conflict. Corinth participated, offered her perspective, negotiated where necessary. She had learned the rhythm of governance, the patience it required, the constant balance between idealism and pragmatism. Afterwards, she found Lucian in the library reviewing reports by lamplight, even though the afternoon sun provided perfectly good illumination. "You're going to hurt your eyes," she said. "I've been reading by lamplight for 15 years. My eyes are already hurt." But he set down the reports and turned to face her. "How was orientation?" "Good. 40 new students, 3 from territories that have never participated before. Because you made it possible. Because we made it possible." Corinth crossed to stand beside his chair. "I couldn't have built any of this without the authority you gave me, the space you made, the support you provided even when the council objected. You would have found a way." Lucian pulled her gently into his lap, an easy intimacy that had developed over 4 years of partnership. "You're extraordinarily stubborn. I learned from the best." She rested her head against his shoulder. "Grandmother Elowin sends her regards, by the way. And a warning that if you don't attend the next Elders' Council session, she'll make you explain to your children why their father doesn't respect his elders." She wouldn't. She absolutely would. They sat together in the library's quiet, Corinth's hand resting on the curve of her belly, where their second child grew, Lucian's hand covering hers. Through the window, they could see Rowena in the courtyard again, now helping a gardener plant seeds in the beds near the Healing Academy. "Do you ever regret it?" Corinth asked quietly. "The tests, the contract, the difficulty of those 60 days. Lucian was quiet for a moment, considering. "No," he said finally, "because those 60 days taught me what I had forgotten. That strength isn't about standing alone. That partnership requires vulnerability. That hope is worth the risk of pain. Your mother was wise. She was, and she would have recognized in you what I recognized that night in the corridor." "What?" "Steel and compassion, strength and gentleness. The ability to fight for what matters while maintaining your humanity." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Everything a queen should be. Everything I needed but didn't know I was looking for." Evening came slowly, as spring evenings do. Corinth and Lucian shared dinner with Elowin and Marguerite, listening to the 2 elders discuss their latest project, a comprehensive history of healing practices across all territories meant to be used in academy curriculum. "We're running out of time," Elowin said matter-of-factly. "Neither of us will live forever. Better to get the knowledge written down while we're still sharp enough to remember it properly." "You'll outlive us all," Marguerite said with affection. "You're too stubborn to die." Everyone dies, Marguerite. The trick is to make sure your work continues after you do. They looked at Corinth as they said this, a shared glance that communicated volumes. This was what they were doing, ensuring continuity, making certain that what they had built, what 3 generations had contributed to, would endure beyond any single lifetime. Later after dinner, after Rowena had been put to bed with a story about a healer who could talk to animals, Corinth and Lucian stood on the balcony outside their chambers and looked out over Velmore Court. The Healing Academy was lit with lanterns, students studying late into the evening. The iron lanterns from their bonding ceremony still hung in the garden, permanent fixtures now lighting the paths that so many feet had worn smooth over 4 years. In the distance, they could see lights from all 7 core territories, peaceful and secure. I used to stand here alone, Lucian said quietly, for 10 years, looking out at the territories and feeling the weight of it all, the responsibility, the isolation. And now I stand here with you, and the weight is still there, it always will be, but it's shared, and that makes it bearable. Corinth leaned against him, feeling the solid reality of his presence, the warmth of his body against hers. 4 years ago, she had sewn a white dress by candlelight for a man who didn't deserve it. She had walked into a great hall expecting validation and received humiliation instead. She had stood in a cold corridor with shaking hands and met a man who asked if she was hurt. And from that moment, everything had changed, not because of fate, not because of magic, though her mother's gift had played its part, but because of choice, daily choice. The decision to build something together, to trust each other, to remain vulnerable, even when it would have been easier to close off. I'm glad I stayed, Corinth said softly. That night, the 1 hour that became 3. So am I. They stood together on the balcony as night settled over Velmore Court, as stars appeared in the darkening sky, as their daughter slept peacefully in her room, and their second child grew in Corinth's belly. They stood as partners, as equals, as 2 people who had chosen each other consciously and continued choosing each other every day. Below them, the Healing Academy's lights burned bright. Students from territories that had once been enemies studied side by side, learned from each other, built friendships that would span decades. The work continued. The circle remained unbroken. And in the window of the royal chambers, a woman who had once been no one from nowhere in particular stood beside the Alpha King and understood that she had found exactly what she had been seeking all along. Not a dress that would transform her, not validation from someone else, not even a crown or a title, just herself, whole and chosen, building something that would outlast them both, teaching others that healing mattered, that community mattered, that love, real love, the kind you built day by day, choice by choice, was the strongest magic of all. The border girl had become a queen, and the kingdom had learned that sometimes the most important leaders are the ones who come from nowhere, who know what it means to struggle, who understand that true strength is measured not by what you can take, but by what you can give. Corinth Ashwood Thorne stood on the balcony with her husband and her unborn child and the life they had built together, and she was content, not because the story was finished, but because the work continued and she was exactly where she needed to be.